Former British Ambassador Peter Ford is an expert on Middle East. He served as British Ambassador to Syria and Bahrain before joining the United Nations to work on refugee issues. He campaigns for a more balanced view of Syria and its present crisis. From 1971 until 1999, he worked for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, serving in Beirut, Cairo, Singapore, Paris and Riyadh, as well as here in London. From 1999 until 2003, British Ambassador to Bahrain. From 2003 until 2006, British Ambassador to Syria. From 2006 until 2015, representative of the Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees based in Jordan. Currently, commentator on Syria, advisor to the Bahrain Royal Charity Organization. I spoke to Ambassador Peter Ford about his experience in the Middle East, the blur of asymmetric warfare and media manipulation. Thank you, Ambassador Peter Ford, for your time to be our guest on Embassy Media.
You're very welcome.
Let me start by asking you, Middle East politics is changing and so are the dynamics in the region. As a former ambassador in Syria and Bahrain, and having served in various posts in other states in the region, what can you tell us about the region?
Well, it has changed vastly from the time when I first became interested in the area in the early 70s. My first posting as a young diplomat was in Lebanon. Then I went to Egypt. Now, Egypt in those days was the center of the Arab universe. Today, it's completely marginal. What has happened during that period? Well, many things, but essentially the Arab world has become a lot less united than it was. In the 70s, forces of Arabism, Arab nationalism, support for Palestine, ideology, socialist, Ba'athist, communist ideology tended to bring most of the Arab world together. And we saw this in the shape of the Arab League. Today, where is the Arab League? Nowhere. It's a nothing institution. What we've seen has been a splitting up of Arab countries which have become more and more divided. In the Gulf, the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, was formed, which already took away from the Arab League. But in the last 2 years, we have seen that the GCC itself is splitting up, thanks to rivalry between Qatar and with some support from one or two other members of the GCC and the Saudi front, Saudi, Emirates, Bahrain. So you see this progression towards more and more splitting up. Whether this will continue is now the key question. In place of that Arab nationalism and socialism and these other forces that were pulling the Arab world together, what we've seen are other forces, particularly religion, in the shape of sectarianism, rivalry with Iran, especially across the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, rivalry with this other strong regional power. These factors became progressively more important and remain extremely important. However, the Syrian crisis, interestingly, has brought back some aspects of the old situation, not least the importance of Russia. In the 1970s, Russia was a major player in the region, and that only stopped in the 1990s. Now we're seeing Russia coming back via Syria. Iran is stronger. I sense that in a way we are going back to the future in the Arab world, that some of the Arab world will, once Syria is settled, the Arab world will start to pull together again, and the forces, we may see again the forces of Arab nationalism asserting themselves. When I was ambassador in Syria, I was lucky in that for most of that time relations were good, or at least correct. This was in the period 2002 to 2006, when Bashar was still a relatively new, Bashar al-Assad still a relatively new president, having a honeymoon with the Western powers, who were hoping that he would become their client. This was not going to be realized. However, Bashar al-Assad did visit London just 1 month before I began my assignment, and sat there in Buckingham Palace having tea with Her Majesty the Queen. Unimaginable today, and yet this is the same Bashar al-Assad. He hasn't changed, but we have. So my experience was extremely positive. I liked everything about Syria in those times, with one exception, what they were doing in Lebanon.
Yeah.
For me personally, this was an issue because I loved Lebanon. I learned Arabic in Lebanon, and I served in Lebanon. I thought that their control over Lebanon had gone on for too long. And part of my job during the years I was there was to help persuade, put pressure on the Syrians to leave Lebanon, which eventually they did. I had a lot more sympathy with Syria over the other key issue which emerged, the issue of the war on Iraq, the war of choice launched by Western countries against Iraq, as part of a clear, wider agenda to take down a number of governments in the Arab world that Washington didn't like. Washington made no secret of the fact that if they were successful in Iraq, then they would next turn their attention to Syria. And not surprisingly, the Syrians tried to delay that moment by helping to make things difficult for the Americans and the British, by allowing jihadis, many of them from Jordan, as well as Syria, to cross into Iraq and make life difficult for the American forces there. And this was how relations began to deteriorate with Bashar al-Assad.
It is said that you have voiced concern over some of the policies Western nations have pursued. You had the British Syrian Society. How difficult is it to try and persuade policymakers as well as the general public when the narrative have been repeated ad nauseum and ingrained?
It's extremely difficult to get a hearing for any alternative viewpoint, alternative to that of the government. About Syria or any other key issue of international policy. Although there is democracy and freedom in Britain, nevertheless, on issues of what you might call national security, there is far less freedom in practice. There is a stifling limitation on what you can say and even what you can think about an issue like Syria, a country with which the United Kingdom is effectively at war. We have launched bombing raids on Syria. This is an act of war. And so on these issues of national security, institutions like the BBC become the voice of the government very blatantly. And the BBC is a very effective propaganda tool which sets the agenda for much of the rest of the international mainstream media. It's therefore extremely difficult to get a hearing. In fact, we only manage to get something of a hearing when when a crisis is very hot. And in those circumstances, Syria is on the news 24 hours a day. The studios need more talking heads, and sometimes I get chance, or someone a bit like myself, an alternative voice, manages to get in front of the cameras. And only then can we get a hearing in the mainstream media. Fortunately, these days, thanks to the internet, there is an alternative world of media. There's internet radio, internet television, there's social media. And the mainstream media are now competing with this new world. And this has leveled the playing field a bit. Alternative voices stand a much better chance of being heard in these alternative modern forms of media. It's a kind of asymmetric warfare. You know, this concept where you have a giant superpower and there is no symmetry. There's no equivalence with a small group of guerrilla fighters, militants, like in the conflict in Syria. You might say there was asymmetric warfare between the Syrian government, backed by Russia, and the jihadi militants. This is asymmetric warfare. Well, in the world of information warfare, which is just as important as the battlefield on the ground, in this field of information warfare, I am like a jihadi. I am the freedom fighter, fighting to get my voice heard with some success thanks to these new methods of communication. The small guy or the small group can get their voice heard and are feared by the mainstream media, which is why they attack us and try to slander us and smear us, because we are having an impact.
How important is the social media?
More and more. It would be hard to exaggerate the importance, especially for younger people who in Britain are voting more and more. We saw in the last general election that young voters, and these young people in particular, don't get their news from the BBC. They get it from YouTube or from tweets. They live in a different information world, and they're much more open to and welcome alternative voices. So it's a very interesting field. The mainstream media and governments are very uneasy about this development, which is why they try but fail to control it.
You were talking about BBC. BBC and institutions. Can you please explain more?
The BBC is a very important institution,
yes.
And it tends to recruit individuals who fit a certain profile. It, by and large, in the area that we're talking about, international issues, national security, the BBC does not welcome alternative voices. The kind of people that they have will, without reflection, without thinking, echo government spokesmen. That's how it is. I was interviewed a couple of times by the BBC and Sky News. I would make my point, and then the interviewer would reply to me like they were the government spokesman. It was incredible. Instead of being impartial, which they claim to be in matters of international policy and anything that involves military or intelligence, their principles of neutrality and objectivity go out of the window, and they become simple voices for the establishment, of which they are a very important part, and which they hope they actually help to form the consensus which spreads over government and in think tanks and the BBC and other major channels. So it's very important to fight against this, and I see myself in the vanguard.
How do you go about changing public perceptions of a country when there is so much negative media that is intent on drawing out the truth?
I've bad news for you. It's almost impossible. It's almost impossible, unless you are extremely rich. In that case, you have several possible strategies. Like Saudi Arabia, you can buy understanding and support from Western media and governments by buying Western arms and selling your oil and creating economic self-interest. Or like Qatar, you can buy and develop an airline. You can brand your country the same way you brand a television station or a football team or an airline. This is Qatar's preferred route. Or, like Bahrain, you can effectively sell your real estate to the American military. These are all possible strategies if you're willing to give up your independence, your dignity, and your pride. And my impression is that Eritrea is not willing to do that.
Ambassador, let me take you to the migrations issue. Who benefits from refugee crisis?
That's a very interesting question, and it poses itself particularly with regard to Eritrean refugees in the West and Syrian refugees. These are the two biggest categories. In the case of the Syrian refugees, we see right this moment attempts by the Western powers to prevent Syrian refugees from going home. Amazing. You might think that the Western countries, which have had so many difficulties with absorbing refugees, would be in a hurry to get them to go back. But this is not the case. We are seeing that the United Nations is actively discouraging refugees in Lebanon who want to go back to Syria, which is now largely pacified. They want to go back, and the United Nations Refugee Agency is advising them that it's probably not safe. Incredible. This is absolutely unbelievable. Now, why are they doing this? Because there is an unspoken Western strategy to keep Syria weak by keeping it depopulated. This is a weapon of war, depopulation, forcing hundreds of thousands of people to leave a country and then not allowing them to go back, or creating incentives for them to leave. The European countries open their doors to encourage Syrian refugees to leave, paid big money to Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon to keep and house these refugees, and is now doing nothing to encourage them to go back. A sensible Western policy would be to fund rehousing in Syria itself. A child could see this, and it would be in the Western countries, or at least their societies, the ordinary people's interest, but it's not in the government's interest, because they want still to change the regime in Syria. If hundreds of thousands, millions of Syrians return, this will help to normalize Syria, to stabilize Syria. It will help the economy, because this is one of the keys to economic development, population growth. Even in a country like Britain, we see that any growth that we've had in the last several years has come largely through migration. Incredible as this may seem, given the debate about immigration in this country, the economic fact, and you have only to walk the streets of London or any British city to see this, the growth comes largely from migrants, because it's more mouths to feed, it's more services to provide, more investment. This is what Syria needs, and I'm sure it's what Eritrea also needs. but the Western countries have created many incentives for people to leave Eritrea as well as Syria, and incentives to stay and not go back. It's all part of a strategy to keep weak these countries which the Western powers find to be awkward and not compliant. This is largely, I believe, a pretext to be able to put pressure on countries to adopt certain policies. And Eritrea, proud Eritrea, never kneel Eritrea, has not been willing to be coerced, to be forced to accept certain Western policies. And the result is that the Western powers have exploited issues, inevitable issues of development and social policy. They've created incentives to encourage people to leave Eritrea, and by levying sanctions on Eritrea have helped to create the conditions which lead to more refugees. It's profoundly hypocritical and in fact counterproductive.
How has information in the media been manipulated to suit political agendas?
Well, we have to realize that there is a thing called Infowars. Infowars. We see this particularly in the case of relations with Russia and the issue of Syria. That there are almost military camps fighting for control of the airwaves, for the information battlefield. And that's what it is. There is a propaganda battle. A television station like RT, Russia Today, a channel which is kind enough to invite me frequently, and which I'm glad to be on because I'm largely ignored by the BBC and others. A channel like RT is a weapon of propaganda. But the BBC is also a weapon of propaganda. It's just that they are a bit more subtle about it, a bit more indirect, a bit less obvious, but they are a weapon of propaganda, I would say, 100 times more effective and significant than RT, which is a minority interest. And there are, of course, dozens of these mainstream channels, Fox News, CNN, Sky News, France 24, all peddling the same Western government narratives. So these info wars go on. They're also conducted under the radar on internet, tweeting, blogging, internet radio. It's an enormous battlefield, just as important as the military battlefield. But disinformation has always been one of the key weapons of propaganda. But I think we've seen a big increase in the use of it, particularly in the Syrian situation. It has become, in fact, absolutely central to the Syrian situation, because the biggest crises in Syria have arisen over episodes of fake news, of alleged use of chemical weapons. Now, chemical weapons themselves are part of a big fake news story. Many people, incredibly, have forgotten Iraq and how the fake news about Iraq having chemical weapons was the pretext for the biggest war of this century so far. So this issue of fake news and how it applies via the issues of chemical weapons and human rights abuses, this is central to what's going on in Syria and the wider struggle between countries that want to be independent and countries that are willing to bend the knee, basically. And in Syria, we've had a very good example recently, the Duma crisis, where there was fake news about an alleged chemical attack. In fact, the jihadis had staged this. It was a piece of theater. After the city of Duma was liberated, Syrian and Russian TV conducted interviews with the people who were in the videos, who said that this was a fake. This was staged. This was a setup. This was a piece of theater. The Russians even took these witnesses to Geneva, where, of course, they were not believed. This is the irony, that falsehood becomes truth, and truth becomes falsehood in this world of fake news. So no one knows anymore what is true and what is false. And truth is stood on its head.
Obviously, you have some knowledge of Eritrea. When was the last time that you visited the country?
It was probably about 5 or 6 years ago. But I stay up to date via my wife, who keeps me very well informed about developments there. And of course, I have family there.
Various media are now talking about Eritrea's strategic importance. What do you consider those to be? Is it cannot just be about its strategic location? So why is Eritrea important?
I suspect that for the smaller country, not being important is a good thing, because then the great powers leave you alone. This should be your ambition. If you're a small country like Eritrea, being left alone is the ideal. Hopefully early in the new year, I'm hopeful I may be able to visit along with a leading member of the British Parliament.
Thank you, Ambassador Peter Ford, for giving me this opportunity to talk to Embassy Media.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.